Okay, today I want to talk about GraphQL. Three things. The unfulfilled promise, what I think the promise was and why I think it wasn't fulfilled. Why I think it's even worse than a leaky abstraction. And what I think the correct approach is instead of GraphQL. At least for this particular issue, I honestly don't see a reason to use GraphQL at all because I feel like every problem that it tries to solve, there's another way of solving it better. But let's go one by one. Let's start with what is a promise that I think GraphQL tried or promised to fulfill that, but they didn't. First of all, a bit of context. We were coming from an industry that more often than not, when developing a system, a distributed system, would have one team with different capabilities. Two of them were front-end and backend. You may have there like QA, you may have design, you may have a Scrum Master. But what we're going to focus now is on front-end and backend and its dependency. While on paper, this was one team, what happened in practice was that you had two different teams talking about different things, completely different tasks that they were working on. They didn't really understand what the other was working on. They didn't care. It was a waste of time. And to make matters worse, there was a dependency that went mostly one way. The front end depended on the back end. So now if the front end needs a new endpoint, for example, or needs a new filter in the form of a query parameter, they need to open a ticket or they need to discuss it with the backend. They need to wait for the backend to implement it so they can start working on it. So this, of course, creates a dependency, creates delays, creates friction. This was very common in the industry back in the day. And in this context, GraphQL steps up and says, hey, you don't need to wait anymore for the backend. Now you can query whatever data you need from the database, seemingly directly from the database or from whatever other data source that you have. You just need to implement this layer in between, and that's it. No more dependency, no more REST. You don't need any of that. And at the time, I thought this was the solution to this problem, and I jumped on board and I loved it. I thought this was the future. The problem is that engineering is the art of managing complexity. Complexity and these dependencies don't go away. You just manage them. You just decide where and when you want this complexity. And the same happened here. This dependency didn't go away. It got even worse. And that takes me to my second point. This is the only leaky abstraction I can think that leaks both ways. What do I mean by that? Usually a leaky abstraction leaks implementation details outside to the consumer. For example, in order to use an API, you need to understand how it's implemented. Or it leaks out some error with internal terminology that only makes sense in the context of the implementation, but not to the consumer. That is a leaky abstraction. In the case of GraphQL, it leaks both ways. For example, you as a backend developer set up a database. Now frontend starts consuming it, saving data. One day the database is on fire. What's going on? You don't know. You are not responsible for the code that generated that incident. But somehow you are responsible to solve it because you're responsible for the database health, but not for the code that can lead to incidents. Now, from the front-end perspective, you used to have an endpoint provided to you with certain parameters, with certain return structure, very clear what you would expect from that and how it would behave. Now, you can basically query anything. You start querying, now the database is slow, you don't know what's going on because you didn't implement the resolvers. So now you need to understand how those resolvers are implemented, leaking the abstraction out. So it leaks both ways. Well, and this takes me to my last point. What is a correct approach here? Well, it depends, of course. I think there's one scenario in which you can merge both teams. As I said, there are only two ways of getting rid of this dependency. And one of them is to merge the team. And I think that microservices has been very important in being able to achieve that. Once you can have a simple enough backend with information that querying it should be literally, I don't know if trivial, but next to trivial at least, then you can have a group of front-end developers maintaining its own backend, querying the database. You don't have that dependency anymore. Now, if there are more complex logic that needs to live somewhere else, well, now you can have a backend team that simply acts as another service. If I'm in the front-end team, we're talking about our database that we need to fix. And finally, GraphQL failed to deliver on that because I think that the answer was there all along. REST is the correct abstraction. GraphQL failed to deliver on their promise because REST was the correct abstraction all along. It allows the backend to put out a clear contract while you as a consumer know what to expect. And if you need more from this team, then they need to implement it. You can't go around querying their database and messing up with their backend. Thank you.